Before we dive in, pause for a moment and tell me something. Where in the world are you watching from? And what time is it right now? Maybe it's sunrise in Nairobi, midnight in New York, afternoon in Canada, or evening in France. Don't just watch quietly. Drop a comment below, and let's see how far this story reaches across the world. Now, lean in, and let's begin. Rain came down hard enough to sand the skin. Bastien Durand, better known by the whispered name Valence, stood in it with wrists roped and boots buried to the ankle in Belle Riviere's street muck. He tasted metal, gun oil, and mud. Sheriff Armand Beaumont pressed a pistol behind his ear, breath sour with whiskey and victory. The crowd kept a careful distance, the way folks do when they want to see blood without getting any on their shoes. Lightning cut the sky and, for a heartbeat, showed him what mattered. Colette Aubry, in a blue kerchief, chin lifted, eyes steady, as if she could hold back a storm just by looking at it. Her small shake of the head said everything. Don't speak, don't fight, not yet. Bastien lowered his gaze, rolled his shoulders once to feel where the rope gave, and counted breaths the way you count coins. 10, slow in, 10, slow out. The sheriff loved an audience. "This is how legends end," he announced, turning so his gold tooth would catch lamplight. Valence, the thief, the ghost, the so-called gentleman bandit, caught skulking like a rat. Laughter scattered thin as straw. Bastien saw the slip in the man's stance before he heard it. The pistol's hammer half-cocked, wet with rain, the powder cap dark and sulking. He didn't plan heroics, he planned survival. He twisted his wrists so the knot bit skin, then he drove his shoulder backward into Beaumont's ribs like a battering ram. The gun barked with a stuttering click and a spit of fire that went nowhere. Bastien dropped to one knee, rolled, and came up under the barrel. Two deputies lunged. Bastien went the way water goes, around. He slipped, fainted, and took a boot scraping of rope fibers off a rusted nail jutting from the blacksmith's post. Pain lit his palms, bright and honest. He felt the rope give. The rain turned the alley to grease, hiding his tracks, swallowing his breath. He cut left behind the tannery where steam and stink hid everything, then right over stacked hides slick as fish. A bullet snapped the edge of a barrel, and wooden splinters stung his cheeks. Another ricochet sang off the bell's iron lip. He didn't waste a look back. Counting mattered more than looking. 1, 2, 3, turn, 4, 5, jump the broken trough. 6, go low and slide. At the riverbank the world went quiet, as if all the rain had run out of noise. Cottonwoods leaned over the water like old men listening. Bastien tied the last strands of rope around a root to fake a drowning, then slid into the current where the river bent. It was a bend he knew by heart, the shape he'd drawn as a mark on notes he left for people he helped. Water closed over him, cold as a forge quench. He let it take his hat, his shape, his sins for a second. When he came up under a tangle of willow roots, he saw the bluff and, darker against it, a figure standing calm in the downpour. The hand that lifted in the lightning's white wash was delicate, gloved, almost formal. Colette? Number. Too tall, too still, the posture like a duelist taking aim without a pistol. The figure tipped 2 fingers off the brim of a hat in a manner that said, "I see you, and I'm not done with you." Bastien's chest tightened with a memory he couldn't place. He slid farther along the bank, belly to mud, and promised himself something that felt like a prayer you don't dare say out loud. 1,000 days on the wind, and he'd come back standing. He didn't know yet what he owed, only who. A widow with a blue kerchief, and a boy who laughed in his sleep. Behind him, the posse whooped. Ahead, the river curved like a question mark that would take 3 years to answer. He smiled once into the rain and moved. Months before the street and the rope, Colette Aubry had counted chairs as if numbers could keep grief neat. 3 chairs, always 3, hers at the head of a small pine table. Jules's chair, legs scuffed from a boy's restless feet, and the empty one Etienne had left behind when winter turned a cough into a grave on the ridge. She kept the 3rd chair polished anyway, because habit is a door you don't know how to close. Dawn found her at the bakery, hands buried in dough, face lit by oven glow. Dusk found her mending saddles, leather oil sweet and heavy in the air. People called her useful, then said useful looked too much like proud. They praised her bread and warned each other not to envy a woman with a dead husband. Words were cheap and sharp. The first note came tucked under twine around a loaf someone had paid for twice. The handwriting was careful, educated, nothing like the town's usual scrawl. For firewood, it said in clean French. No name, just a small drawn sign like the river's bend. Colette stood on her porch and held the note against the cold, wondering who in Belle Riviere wrote like Paris. The next week a sack of beans sat by the door, still warm from hands that had carried it far. Then a children's book, spine mended with neat strips of cloth. Jules slept with it under his cheek the way a child sleeps with courage. Rumors marched faster than facts. 2 women in stiff collars crossed the street rather than meet Colette's eye. One man offered to carry water and made sure the town saw. Another warned that charity had strings. Colette smiled with her mouth and saved her real smiles for the kitchen where no one could price them. She taught Jules to read the names on flour sacks, to count nails when they repaired the porch, to listen for the wind through cottonwood leaves the way you listen for a friend knocking. On Sunday, she sat in the last pew and whispered the names of the things she still believed in: mourning, mercy, bread. The big man came quiet. Roche LaRoche, people called him Mountain because man wasn't large enough, stepped into her yard one hot afternoon and lifted a barrel as if it were a question he knew the answer to. He put it down gentle at the well and tipped his hat like chivalry had never gone out of style. He didn't speak much. His eyes did the talking, steady and respectful. Jules buzzed around him with 100 whys, and Roche tied a figure-8 knot slow enough for little hands to learn. Colette gave him a still warm loaf and felt the atmosphere change. Some women frowned sharper, some men watched harder, and Sheriff Beaumont found new reasons to loiter under her awning. That night, Colette sat with the empty chair and let herself ask it one real question. Was a kindness safe if it came from a shadow? The river bend mark lay on the table between salt and sugar. She had known the world could be cruel. She had not expected it to be so suspicious of good. She folded the note and tucked it under Jules's book like a promise. When she blew out the lamp, she thought she heard a horse in the cottonwood snort once, as if impatient for dawn. Somewhere beyond the trees, a man who wrote neatly watched her window and kept a count he would not yet confess, and a tall figure in a long coat marked the house on a mental map the way a hunter marks a den. Roche LaRoche preferred the company of snow and stars to people who asked small questions with large eyes. He lived where the map got blank and winter painted the silence blue. Twice each season he came down to Belle Riviere with pelts rolled tight, traded for salt, lamp wicks, and a handful of words, then vanished before gossip could give him edges. That changed the afternoon he saw Colette bracing her back against a crate at the freight office while the clerk pretended not to notice. Roche didn't wait to be asked. He lifted, shifted, set the weight just inside her door, and backed out of the house like a man leaving a chapel. He meant it to be nothing, but gratitude can make a new road where there wasn't one. Colette's thanks tasted like bread and thyme, and Jules' laughter bounced off Roque's ribs in a way that made the big man feel unarmored. He fixed the hitch on their door in the time it takes to tell a short story, repaired a cracked stool, and, when Jules waved a lopsided wooden horse, whistled admiration as if the boy had whittled Paris itself. He didn't ask about the empty chair, but his glance took it in and softened. He didn't ask about the note with the river mark either, though he spotted it like a tracker spots a bent blade of grass. Sheriff Beaumont disliked two things: men he couldn't bully, and a town that loved something he didn't own. He sauntered by, gold tooth flashing, and leaned against Colette's porch post like it owed him rent. "You taking charity these days?" he asked, too sweet. Roch let the question hang. Beaumont held his gaze for a count of 3, then laughed and told a deputy later that he could make a mountain kneel if he kicked the right rock out from under it. Roche walked away, thinking of rocks. On the road, he stopped, crouched, and ran a thumb over a small sketch traced in dust by a boot heel. The river bend. Not Colette's hand. This line had speed in it, a habit. That night, Roche sat under the cottonwoods and listened the way men listen before a storm. No sound at all. Then a click of flint far off, exactly once. He didn't turn his head, he turned his heartbeat down. "If you mean her good, don't make me choose," he said into darkness that smelled like wet bark. There was a movement, the kind that belongs to animals or careful men. A voice came back low, unthreatening, shaped by school and long rides. "I mean her good." And the boy Roche stared at the spot where the voice hung and waited. He had carried enough broken things to recognize a man trying not to drop one more. He nodded to the night and stood. He would not shake hands with the shadow, but he would not shoot it either. Sometimes a town lasts because its fiercest men decide to be gentle at exactly the right time. Before he wore dust like a second skin, Bastien Durand wore ink. He kept ledgers for a Saint Leon freight line with columns so straight you could run a train on them. He liked numbers because they did not lie if you didn't tell them to. Then a banker with slick hair and a lazy eye moved zeros from one page to another and called it a mistake. Soldiers arrived with smiles that didn't reach their eyes. Bastien tried to speak in the language of proof. The uniform spoke in the language of fists. He spent 2 days and a snow-thin night in a cell, and came out with a lesson carved into his ribs. Sometimes the only way to balance a book is to tear a page out. The first time he took back what had been stolen, he did it like a clerk. No blood, no show, just timing and ropes. A coach lost a wheel exactly where the road narrowed to a ravine. The guard's eyes went to the drop. Not the man whose gloved hands had loosened a pin 10 minutes earlier. Bastien lifted 2 strong boxes and left behind their exact weight in rocks wrapped in burlap, so no one would be scared until it helped no one. He mailed cash orders to families who had known nothing of banks, except that banks never knew them. He sent cough syrup and wool to a widow on a ridge when snow walled in the doctor. He wrote his notes in neat French, unsigned, marked only by a graphite curve like the river bend of his childhood. Valence, the leaning of water toward a shore it loves. Stories grow better when you don't feed them, which is why they grow. A bartender said Valence could walk through walls. A ranch hand swore he shot 6 bullets out of the air. A girl who knew how to listen said he had good boots and better manners. Bastien built his rules on quiet and kept them as if his life depended on them, because it did. Rule 1, never draw first. Rule 2, never take more than the wound needs to heal. Rule 3, write everything down that matters and burn it once it's done. Rule 4, if you must show teeth, make sure the bite saves a life. Sheriff Beaumont hated rule-makers who weren't sheriffs. He set a bounty, then doubled it when nobody smart bit. He called Valence a danger to women and children, and practiced the speech in the mirror with his gold tooth half turned toward the light. Men who owed the banker money agreed loudly. Men who owed Valence a winter coat said nothing, and bought another round for men who said too much. Bastien watched from the timberline and learned the town's rhythms the way you learn a song by heart. 9 o'clock, hymn singing leaks out of the church door. 10, the saloon piano stumbles, then steadies. Midnight, the coal oil lamps in Colette's kitchen go soft, and a blue kerchief hangs on a peg as if it's keeping watch. On the 50th day of a count that had started as a superstition and become a promise, Bastien let himself be foolish. He carved a small wooden horse, sanded its rough spots smooth with his thumb, and left it on Colette's porch where Jules would find it before breakfast. He told himself it was nothing, a bit of kindness tossed into a river that gulped bigger things whole. Then he turned and saw a silhouette at the end of the lane, broad shoulders, hat brim low, hands visible and empty. Roche LaRoche stood there the way a cliff stands, not to block a road, but to keep the road honest. He didn't step forward. He didn't move at all. After a long breath, he lifted one finger, a tiny, careful question. "Friend?" Bastien couldn't answer with a word. He answered with a nod and a hand opened wide, palm facing the sky. The mountain didn't nod back, not right away. But he didn't raise a rifle either. Far off, beyond them both, something else moved. Something with a different kind of stillness. A patience that smiled to itself and started counting too. Belriviere liked to act pious in daylight and cruel after dark. Gossip was its second religion, sharp as knives and twice as plentiful. A widow who wore black too long was a show-off. One who wore colors too soon was a harlot. Colette Aubry learned to live in that no-man's land where every step was too careful and never careful enough. Sheriff Beaumont stoked the fires. He had a knack for making whispers louder and lies stickier, and he used that knack with the same pride he used to flash his gold tooth. When he announced that Valence was a thief of bread and of hearts, people chuckled, but they listened. Roche saw the way eyes followed Colette across the market square. Women who once leaned on her shoulder now whispered behind fans. Men who used to tip hats now watched too long. Beaumont liked to loiter near her counter at the bakery, leaning in close, asking questions with too much sugar. Roche started showing up without invitation, arms folded across his chest, voice calm as he told the sheriff, "Bread's for eating, not for stories." Beaumont would sneer, but he never pressed too far. Even a crooked sheriff knew better than to test a mountain with fists of oak. Bastien watched from the cottonwoods, uneasy. He hadn't meant to put her in the crosshairs of whispers. He wanted to be a ghost who only left warmth and vanished. But ghosts don't leave carved wooden toys on porches. Ghosts don't hover near lamplight and wonder what it would feel like to sit at a warm table again. On the 50th day of his 1,000-day vow, he broke his own rule and stepped closer than he should have. He left the horse for Jules, no note, no sign, just a gift he hoped would speak for him. When he turned to melt back into night, Roche stood in the road like a question that demanded an answer. His silhouette was all shadow and stillness, hands open but not empty. Bastien raised a palm in greeting, silent, respectful. Roche didn't move. The sheriff's laughter drifted from down the street, hollow and ugly, and Bastien understood. This town could break a woman with nothing more than words. He clenched his jaw and retreated into the trees. From above, in the dark ridge, another figure watched both men with a hunter's patience. The storm had not arrived yet, but the sky was learning how to growl. The first storm of winter blew in fierce, erasing every track until even seasoned trappers lost their way. Snow fell so thick it smothered sound, and in that silence, Roche and Bastien stood under the cottonwoods face to face for the first time. Roche's beard was white with frost, his breath slow. "If you mean her good," he said without raising his voice, "don't make me choose." Bastien, gaunt from running, held his palms out, unarmed, honest. "I mean her good." And the boy? They studied each other like rival wolves might study the other's scars. Roche was big enough to snap a man in two, Bastien lean enough to slip through a keyhole. Different men, same goal, protect the house with the blue kerchief in its window. Finally, Roche nodded once, deliberate. "Then I'll count with you," he said, surprising even himself. 1,000 days. Keep clear of her porch. Keep clear of her hands. I'll carry what's heavy. You carry what's dangerous. Bastien's throat tightened. Pride almost made him spit back. But pride had broken him before. He bowed his head once and answered, "Done." That night, Colette rocked Jules by the fire, humming old hymns while snow rattled the shutters. She thought herself alone, unaware of two men outside circling her world like stars that never touched. Roche sat under the eaves with a shotgun across his knees, humming a mountain tune. Bastien crouched beyond the trees, knife ready, eyes on the ridge. A strange peace settled, uneasy but real. The boy slept with the wooden horse under his hand, smiling in his dreams. Sheriff Beaumont drank by his own fire that night, teeth glinting in the mirror. He didn't know yet that his threats and bribes were no longer the only game in town. Nor did he know that someone far more dangerous than either Roque or Bastien had crossed the county line. In the dark, a rider in a long green coat studied Belle Riviere through opera glasses, lips curving with amusement. He wasn't here to enforce law. He was here to sell death to the highest bidder. Trouble arrived, folded neat, like laundry. A letter lay on Colette's counter one frosty morning, sealed with wax, her own name scrawled across it. The odd part, she hadn't written it. When she cracked the seal, her stomach dropped. Inside was a sentence she'd never seen but that someone knew was not hers. Ledger true, river truer. The phrase was in Bastien's hand, one he had written long ago on a note meant for no one in this town. Someone had stolen his words and laid them like a trap. Beaumont wasted no time. He waved the letter in the square, called it proof that Colette was conspiring with the outlaw. "Bread, notes, secret rendezvous," he sang to the crowd, gold tooth winking. The townsfolk muttered like crows, hungry for scandal. Colette stood tall, kerchief tied firm, refusing to defend herself. Silence was dignity, but in Belle Riviere, silence was guilt. Roche shoved through the crowd, voice like granite. The sheriff wrote this himself. Laughter broke the tension, cruel and sharp. "You got proof?" Beaumont grinned. Proof never mattered in a place that liked gossip more than truth. Bastien, hidden in an alley, tasted bile. His words, his neat handwriting, turned into chains around her neck. That night, instead of leaving beans or books, he left something more dangerous, a packet wrapped in oilcloth beneath her porch plank. Inside, carefully drawn in ink, were names, dates, amounts. The bribes Beaumont had pocketed from the banker in Saint Leon. He had traced every coin back to the sheriff's greedy hands. It wasn't a gift. It was a weapon. At dawn, Roche found the packet and brought it to Colette. She unfolded the papers, eyes wide, realizing the outlaw had risked his neck for her name. But outside, a whistle cut through the cold, shrill, playful, like a bird call, not Roche's, not Beaumont's, a hunter announcing himself with arrogance. Bastien stiffened in the woods. That tune belonged to a man he hadn't seen in years, a man who once laughed while shooting load a wound instead of kill. The rider in the green coat had arrived. Monsieur Verdun, they called him, though no one knew if that was his real name. The long green cavalry coat he wore swung like a banner when he rode in, and the polished boots gleamed as if he'd never once seen mud. He spoke like Paris, bowing, smiling, but his eyes were snake black, and his hands, gloved in kid leather, looked made for strangling more than handshakes. He brought letters of praise from Saint Leon, stamped with seals that promised discretion. Everyone knew what that meant. A man who killed quietly and made law look clean. Beaumont welcomed him with a purse heavy enough to bend a belt. Verdun tipped his hat to the sheriff, then turned it smoothly to Colette, bowing with a smile that felt like frost. "Madame Aubry," he purred. "An honor." Roche stepped between them, handshake hard as stone. Verdant let the mountain man squeeze, then withdrew without flinching. He ordered a room above the river, where the view gave him both beauty and strategy. That night, he stood at the window, humming the same whistle that had once chilled Bastien on a coach road. Bastien crouched on the far bank, heart hammering. He remembered that whistle from the night everything went wrong, when a companion shot too low, wounding instead of warning, smiling at the pain. That had been Verdun's style, elegant cruelty. Now the snake had slithered into Belle Riviere with the sheriff's blessing. Bastien tightened his grip on the knife at his belt. He had counted 70 days into his 1,000. The hardest days were ahead. Verdant didn't chase with noise like Beaumont. He hunted with silence, and silence was harder to outsmart. The tannery was always a place of smoke, steam, and stink, where hides hung like ghosts, and men came out with skin that reeked of lime and rot. It was the perfect place for a trap. Monsieur Verdun knew it. Sheriff Beaumont knew it. And Bastien felt it the moment he crept close, hidden by the river fog that rolled in thick that morning. The rumor was simple. A boy had fallen through rotten planks near the vats, trapped where acid ate leather. No one could ignore a child's cry. Colette rushed with a blanket. Roche carried rope on his shoulder. Others followed with buckets of water and alarm in their voices. Bastien's blood turned to ice when he heard Jules. He imagined the boy's small hands clutching at splintered wood, the smell of burning hides choking him. He didn't think. He ran, slipping into the tannery through a broken panel. Inside, the fog and steam turned men into shadows. He heard no boy's cry. Instead, he heard a whisper of metal sliding, boots shifting. Deputies, 2 of them behind a curtain of drying hides, rifles raised. Above, Beaumont stood on the catwalk, teeth flashing, voice oily with triumph. "Gentlemen, our rat returns to the cheese." Verdun watched from higher still, balanced on the rail as if the ground itself wasn't worth touching. He smiled faintly when Bastien slipped between shadows, avoiding the first volley of gunfire. Hides swung like pendulums. Splinters ripped into his sleeve. A bullet hissed past his ear. He didn't fire back. Too loud, too messy. He counted steps instead. 1, 2, 3, pivot. His eyes caught the weakness in the floorboards where chemicals had rotted them thin. One misstep would swallow a man whole. Then Verdant dropped, elegant as a cat, landing in front of him. "Leave the widow," Verdant murmured, low enough no one else heard. "You make her look guilty." Bastien's jaw clenched. "I never meant her harm." Verdant's smile widened. "Then you should have stayed dead." Gunfire erupted. Bastien kicked loose a hook holding hides, sending a wall of dripping leather crashing down. The deputies cursed, blinded. Roche's rope whistled through a broken window, thrown blind. Bastien grabbed it, swung through glass, and landed hard in snow outside. Ribs cracked, breath stolen. Verdant followed, coat swirling, pistol drawn, smile intact. He raised the weapon, sight steady, but instead of shooting, he laughed softly. "Day 143, he said. "Let's keep count together." Bastien stumbled into the tree line, clutching his side, heart pounding. Verdant didn't chase, not yet. He wanted the hunt to last. And from the tannery roof, Sheriff Beaumont laughed so loud it echoed against the riverbank. The town pretended nothing had happened. People went back to bread and whiskey, pretending not to hear the whispers. But under the surface, fear tightened its grip. Colette's bakery still filled each morning with the smell of warm loaves, but her hands trembled when she kneaded dough. Jules slept lighter now, waking at shadows. Roche kept a chair on her porch each night, shotgun across his knees, eyes fixed on the cottonwoods. Bastien, wounded and aching, lit small fires deep in the timber, never close enough to give himself away. He spent those nights writing lists in his neat hand, who could be trusted, who was bought, which paths out of Belle Riviere were safe. He wrote letters to himself he never sent, notes about Colette's strength, Roche's silence, Jules' laughter. Then he burned them one by one, watching words curl into ash. He longed to step out of the trees, to sit at her table and explain that every gift, every risk, had been for her and the boy. But he had sworn to Roche. No porch, no hands, no closeness. So instead he left knowledge. Under the porch, he slid a folded sheet explaining how to seal windows with beeswax to keep the cold out. Another described how to wrap a rifle so recoil wouldn't bruise a boy's shoulder. Another taught how to listen for footsteps in snow, how sound carried farther in winter. Colette read each one in silence, lips tight. She taught Jules quietly, as though it were a game. She hated herself for needing the outlaw's instructions, but she hated Verdant more. One dawn, smoke rose from the cottonwoods, 3 puffs, pause, then 1. The signal Bastien and Roche had agreed upon. Trouble. Colette closed the bakery, tied her kerchief tight and whispered to Jules, "Today, we tell the truth." She didn't know Verdant was already watching from his window, humming a soldier's tune, amused by how easily fear spread. Roche walked into the sheriff's office with Colette at his side, her kerchief bright against the drab wood. They laid the bundle of oilcloth across Beaumont's desk. "What's this?" the sheriff scoffed, trying to look bored. "You're knitting?" Colette unwrapped it. Pages fluttered out, ink sharp, names lined up like soldiers. The banker's crooked marks, Beaumont's signature beside payments marked security expense. Dates, amounts, too many to deny. "This," she said evenly, "is the truth." Beaumont's smile faltered. "Forgery?" His voice was too quick, too thin. Roche leaned forward, massive hands spread on the desk. "It's neater than you write. Cleaner than you steal. You want proof? Burn it. Show us what you're afraid of." The deputies shifted uneasily. They had taken Beaumont's orders for years, but now their eyes flicked to one another, doubt creeping in. Verdant stepped from the shadows in the corner, slow, clapping, his green coat gleaming. "Elegant," he said. "Very elegant." He turned his black eyes on Colette. "But papers don't matter when fire is easier than ink." "I'll take it to Saint Leon," the judge declared, lifting the bundle. "The law will decide." Verdant bowed low, mocking. "Allow me to escort it." "For safety, no," Colette said, her voice steady, cold. "We'll carry it ourselves." Outside, the town gathered, whispering, faces lit with something dangerous, hope. For the first time in months, Beaumont looked small, a man shrinking behind a badge. That night, as snow hissed against the shutters, Bastien rode parallel to the road, shadowing the judge, Colette, and Roche, as they carried the ledger to the river crossing. His ribs still ached, but he told himself, "This is worth it." From the ridge, Verdant struck a match, lit a cigar, and smiled into the dark. The ferry groaned under the judge's weight, under Colette clutching Jules tight, under Roche bracing the mast like it might crack. The river moved fast, chunks of ice swirling like broken glass. The judge studied the papers, lips pressed thin. "I'll need time," he said, "and protection for witnesses." His eyes flicked to Beaumont's name, then to Beaumont himself standing ashore, pale with anger. The ferryman cursed. Water leaked through a fresh hole in the planks. Roche bent to check the rope, and froze. The knot had been cut almost clean through, sliced by a careful blade. Verdant's blade. One tug, and the ferry would swing into jagged rocks, smashing it apart. Bastien moved before thought. He slid down the icy bank, hands bleeding as he clawed roots, and seized the frayed rope. He tied his own line, staked it deep into frozen mud, and heaved until the veins in his arms burned. The ferry lurched, nearly tipping. Jules screamed. Colette clutched him tighter. Roche wrapped both arms around the mast, holding it upright. The judge fell to his knees, whispering prayers. For a moment, Bastien felt his body splitting in two, arms tearing, ribs cracking, lungs begging for air. But he held. He pulled until the ferry thudded against the bank hard enough to throw everyone forward. Snow sprayed, wood splintered, but they were alive. By the time they looked up, Bastien was gone, melted into the timber. Verdant crouched at the water's edge, touching the cut knot with a gloved finger. For the first time since he arrived, his smile slipped. "Interesting," he whispered. "Very interesting." The mill's wheel turned slow that night, dripping moonlight in silver shards across the water. The sound masked Bastien's footsteps as he emerged from shadow, ribs still sore from the ferry struggle. He hadn't meant to come. Every vow he'd made, to Roche, to himself, screamed against it. Yet, when Colette found the paper slip tucked into her apron, 2 words, neat and sharp, "Be careful," she knew who had written them. And she knew where he would be. She found him behind the wheel, hat in hand, face gaunt but eyes alive. For a moment, neither spoke. The air between them was charged, heavy with all the words they had swallowed for months. Finally, Colette's voice cracked the silence. "You put my boy first." "Always," Bastien said simply. Her lips trembled, caught between smile and sorrow. "You can't stay." "I know." The kiss was not stolen. It was shared, soft, full of the honesty they had denied themselves. It was a promise neither could keep, a goodbye they could not yet bear. They pulled apart at the same moment, as if their hearts had learned the same rhythm. Roche's silhouette filled the doorway, shotgun slung but eyes steady. He did not rage, he did not accuse. His voice was flat, measured. Verdant has a friend at the telegraph. A wire went out. More hunters come with dawn. Bastien slipped his hat back on, jaw set. "Then we finish this before morning." Colette's hands trembled as she tied her kerchief tighter, eyes burning with both fear and fire. Roche nodded once, the mountain siding with the outlaw. The river turned its wheel, steady as fate, and in the distance the telegraph clicked like a clock counting down. Bastien knew the sheriff's power didn't rest in his pistol. It rested in the town's belief that lies were easier than truth. So he decided to break that belief. He became a rumor you could touch, knocking once, twice on doors, then vanishing, leaving slips of paper with simple instructions. Bring 1 lantern, no more. By midnight, the schoolyard glowed with 100 small flames. Farmers, mothers, children, all stood clutching lanterns, faces pale but hungry for answers. Bastien stood before them, visible for the first time in months. His voice carried, not with anger, but with truth. "You've been told stories about me. Tonight you'll hear one about your sheriff." He hung the ledger pages on a clothesline strung between posts, papers fluttering like condemned men's shirts. One by one he read them aloud. Dates, payments, Beaumont's signature carved like shame into every line. Every time he said a number, another lantern dimmed, lowered by someone whose eyes stung with guilt or betrayal. Murmurs rippled. Some gasped, some cried. Verdant watched from the shadows, lips curling in genuine admiration. Elegant, yes, dangerous too. But Beaumont wasn't finished. He had sent Verdant's man to the stables hours earlier with oil and matches. Suddenly, the church bell clanged wild. Flames licked the sky. Horses screamed. A shout tore the night. "Fire!" The crowd scattered, running with buckets, chasing panic. The truth was forgotten in smoke. Bastien shouted above the chaos. "Save the animals. Save your town, bring the pages." He reached for the ledger, but a pistol muzzle pressed against his chest. Verdant stepped from behind the bell tower, coat gleaming green in lantern light. His eyes glittered with delight. "Your stage," he said softly. "My applause." For a moment, everything shrank to the width of a coin. Verdant's pistol, Bastien's heart, a single snowflake drifting between them. Verdant tilted his head like a curious bird. "You could have been a fine clerk," he said. "Instead, you chose legend. Legends end." He pulled the trigger. Click. The hammer fell useless. Verdant's smile twitched. He cocked the gun again. Click. A shadow stepped from the smoke. Rod holding a small tin filled with screws and springs. "You dropped something at the tannery," he said. His tone was almost casual, but his eyes were fire. Verdant's jaw tightened. He reached into his coat and drew a second pistol, sleeker, oiled, deadly. He raised it, but a rifle cracked before he could fire. The pistol spun from his hand, clattering into snow. Verdant hissed in pain, clutching his wrist. Colette stood at the bell rope, rifle still hot, kerchief slipping back to reveal her face carved in steel. Her voice rang out, clear and cold. "Leave my town." Verdant looked at her, then at Roche, then at Bastien. For the first time, calculation outweighed arrogance. He bowed mockingly, backing away. "For now," he murmured. His eyes promised return, but his body melted into the smoke. The crowd swarmed back, shouting, panicked. Beaumont was nowhere to be seen. Bastien looked down at his chest, amazed to still be breathing. He laughed once, raw and shaky, and whispered, "Not today." But deep down, he knew. Verdant wasn't gone. He was only waiting. And waiting was sometimes worse than fighting. No one slept. The bakery became a courthouse. Sacks of flour turned to benches, the oven's warmth battling the cold fear outside. The judge returned, soot staining his cuffs, and took testimony until dawn. People who had once whispered now spoke loudly. A blacksmith who'd seen bribes, a stable boy who'd watched Beaumont's gold tooth glint in lamplight, a widow who'd been threatened in letters sweet as poison. Roche laid down the rope stake from the ferry, showing the clean cut of Verdant's blade. Colette unfolded Beaumont's notes to her, voice steady as she read his veiled threats. One by one, the sheriff's illusions collapsed. Deputies peeled off their badges and laid them on the counter, ashamed. Bastien sat by the door, half in shadow, counting. Hoofbeats outside, flickers of lanterns, breaths in the room. He knew this peace was fragile. Verdant wasn't finished. He whispered his own count under his breath. 220 nights survived. 780 left. Outside, Verdant whispered different numbers. He stood with 2 men by the ridge, oil jars in their hands. "Don't shoot them," he instructed. "Break them. Burn them." He smiled, teeth white in moonlight. "Burn the house with the blue kerchief." By the time Bastien caught the first whiff of smoke, it was already too late. Flames clawed up Colette's porch, wood shrieking. Jules cried out from his bed. Bastien ran, faster than thought, faster than fear. The long night of counting ended in fire, and Bastien had no choice left but to run into it. Flames climbed Colette's porch as if the wood itself had been praying for a reason to scream. The window panes coughed bursts of orange, and smoke rolled under the eaves in thick black shoulders. Bastien ran before the town could finish shouting the word fire. He didn't think about the vows he'd made to stay off that porch. He didn't think about the ledger or Verdant, or the 1,000 days he'd been counting like a monk counting rosaries. He thought only of the small bed by the hearth and the boy who dreamed there. He pulled his coat over his mouth, drove his shoulder through the door, and felt heat seize the air inside like a giant hand closing. Sparks snapped against his neck. The room was a furnace made of memory. Etienne's chair, the sewing chest, the blue kerchief on its peg, each shape outlined in furious light. "Jules!" he shouted, but the fire swallowed his name, turned it into a roar that answered no man. Jules crouched by the hearth exactly as Colette had taught him, hands over his mouth, eyes enormous and shining with the terrible belief that Bastien would come. Bastien dropped to his knees and slid, the floor slick with spilled lamp oil. He caught the boy under the arms, wrapped him in his coat and turned to the window. The frame was stubborn, swollen with heat, stubborn the way old wood gets when it has held too much love. Bastien kicked the sash hard. It gave a little like a man changing his mind. He needed a battering ram. His eyes fell on the sewing chest, Etienne's chest, heavy with needles and folded shirts, and the letters Colette kept like beads. He drove his heel into the chest, felt the wood split, swung half of it into the glass, and the window shattered outward with a sound like a flock of birds sprinting into sky. Outside, Roach stood below the window, coat over his head, hands raised like he was ready to receive the whole burning house. Bastien pushed Jules forward. Roach took the boy like catching a newborn, wrapped him in his greatcoat, and ran him clear to the fence where Colette waited on her knees, arms open, hair loose, face frantic. "Breathe, mon coeur, breathe," she cried, pressing Jules to her, rocking him, counting out loud as if numbers were magic and could pull air back into a small chest. Behind them, the flames chewed through rafters, the roof muttering its last. Bastien turned back because a house is more than wood and beds. It is papers that keep a life true. He could see the floorboard that clicked when you stepped on it. The one Roch had fixed and left easy for the family to open. He yanked it up, grabbed the box beneath, and the fire roared a protest so loud it shook his ribs. He stumbled out with the box clutched to his chest, coat smoking, eyebrows singed, coughing a cough that could have been the last thing he ever did. Colette met him halfway, touched his face with both hands, and pressed her forehead to his smoky hair with a gratitude too raw for words. She tried to speak. Merci, God, Bastien, Jules. But the sentences tumbled over each other and turned to tears. He pressed the box into her hands. Inside were birth papers, a silver locket with a curling lock of Etienne's hair, 3 letters written in a younger hand that said, "Love like it was a new invention." The roof surrendered then with a hollow groan and collapsed into its own heat. The yard brightened as sparks lifted and whispered into the night. People gathered in a ring, their silhouettes tall and stunned. Someone began to pray. Across the road, Verdant watched from the shadow of a cottonwood, expression unreadable. He had sent the fire to break patience, not bodies. He wanted to make Bastien run, not make him a savior. But the outlaw had marched into flame and brought a boy out whole. Verdant's mouth tightened by the width of a thumbnail. Beaumont cursed beside him, gold tooth dim in the dark. "We'll pin this on him," the sheriff hissed. "Arson to hide the ledger." Verdant didn't answer. He studied the way the town ringed Bastien now, not with chains, not with guns, but with the old human silence reserved for men who have done something hard and good. He watched Colette's hands tremble as she set the box down and touched Bastien's face like a sacrament. For the first time, Verdant considered that his cleverness might not be enough. Dawn found the square full and the bakery's door wide as a courthouse. The judge stood at a floor-dusted table, coat off, sleeves rolled, pen scratching warrants that would make a different shape of the town by noon. Deputies filed in, and one by one they set their badges on a folded towel like returning stolen things. Beaumont pushed through the crowd with bluster, but bluster was cheap by morning light. His voice tried for righteous boom and landed on hoarse complaint. "You're throwing this place to wolves," he shouted, jabbing a finger toward Bastien. "You'll beg me to take it back when he robs the church." No one cheered. Some looked away. Some looked at their boots. Many looked at Colette, at the soot on her face and the way her hands held Jules's shoulders with a steady that made men ashamed of their smaller kind of strong. The judge read the charges: bribery, extortion, conspiracy to commit arson. His words were dry, as good words should be when they hold heavy things. He lifted his eyes from the paper. "Sheriff Beaumont," he said, "remove your badge." Beaumont laughed once like a dog cough. "You don't take a man's badge with a sentence," he said. "You take it with a fight." He grabbed Colette's arm then, thoughtless, desperate, the reflex of a man who has only ever learned to hold by force. 100 people inhaled in one ragged breath. Roch moved the way big weather moves, slow and unstoppable. He took the sheriff's wrist in his hand and uncurled it like a child's, then set it gently down on the table as if returning cutlery. "Don't," the mountain said, and the word reached every ear. From a roofline, one of Verdant's men cocked a rifle. It made a sound like a cricket at the end of summer. Verdant didn't raise a hand, didn't breathe a warning. He was measuring the math of the moment. 1 shot to start an avalanche of them. 12 dead, a ledger ash-gray and useless in the aftermath. He had sold outcomes to powerful men before. But something in the square had changed. The town had stepped into its own voice. "Hold," the judge said, palm up, tone even. "We fall to blood and we bury children. Or we hold to truth like rope." The roofman's finger trembled on the trigger, but his eyes went to the faces below. Wives, cousins, men who had lifted him when he fell drunk behind the saloon. He uncocked the gun. Verdant clicked his tongue softly, annoyed at decency's untimely courage. The judge turned to Bastien. "Valence," he said, and the name rolled through the square with an odd new respect. "You have taken what was not yours." A murmur. Bastien nodded once, and the nod took courage. "You have also returned what was stolen by others and saved lives at risk to your own." The law is not blind to the whole story. The judge set a hand on the ledger like a priest on a Bible. "You will repay what can be counted. You will labor for what cannot. And if this town chooses to forgive the rest, it may. I will not chain a man who carried a child out of fire." For a second, the square hung between two futures like a rider between saddles. Verdant lifted his chin and smiled like a card player folding a weak hand before anyone saw it. "We'll be leaving," he said to Beaumont lightly, as if discussing weather. He stepped back into shadow, and his men slipped after him like threads pulled from cloth. Beaumont's face flickered between rage and fear. Rage won and collapsed under its own weight. Deputies took him without a fight. A sound rose then, not exactly a cheer, not exactly a cry, something that had been trapped in Belle Riviere's chest and found an exit. People turned, as if on cue, toward Bastien. He set his hat in his hands and waited. Chains did not come. Instead, the baker's boy who'd watched the fire brought him a cup of water and said, "Merci, monsieur." The judge drew a breath and looked over the square like a man looking over a field after a storm. "We begin again," he said, "but with our eyes open." That evening, after the ledger had been locked, after Beaumont had been led away, the town did something odd and useful. It worked. Buckets moved, shingles lifted, hammers sang a steady hymn. The ruin of Colette's house became a frame by moonlight. Roche took the ridgepole on his shoulder as if it weighed nothing. Bastien, unchained, climbed the rafters and nailed planks in straight lines that would hold against future winters. Nobody asked where he slept when the last nail was set. Colette set a kettle on a salvage stove under the stars and poured coffee into chipped cups. She handed one to the judge, one to Roche, one to Bastien, fingers brushing his. Accident, intention, the first small public truth. 3 summers taught Belle Riviere how to breathe without flinching. Wheat stood taller. Children ran feral and came home at dusk with pockets full of marvels. Blue stones, bird bones, stories. The new roof on Colette's house learned to sing in rain, and the porch learned to hold 3 chairs without envy. One for Colette, one for Jules, one empty each evening at twilight, when the day took off its hat and waited. Bastien paid debts like a man paying a lifelong tithe. He hauled freight in winter when other men refused the ice. He fixed a schoolhouse door that had stuck since anyone remembered. He counted nails and smiled at straight lines. When the banker of Saint-Léon finally faced his own paper in a court that couldn't be bribed, the town's shopkeepers stood and nodded like trees in wind. Beaumont wrote letters from a far cell. In them, he rehearsed reform like a man practicing a language he would never speak well. The judge saved the letters in a drawer labeled cautionary. Roche took to showing Jules the long paths, how to walk the ridge without tempting the sky, how to read where a deer has changed its mind, how to find water by listening to the ground. Jules shot up like a weed and learned to laugh with his whole back. He wore the wooden horse at his belt like a relic till the string frayed and the horse fell and he cried as if losing a friend. Bastien carved another without being asked and left it on a step at dawn. Jules pretended not to know who had made it and ran a finger over the sanded smoothness like prayer beads. Colette's hands relearned calm. Sometimes she caught herself humming and stopped, as if happiness were something that needed to be snuck into the day under a coat. Then she would laugh at her own caution and hum louder. Verdun vanished like fog, but absence is its own kind of presence. Once a parcel arrived with no return, a long green cavalry coat folded like a flag, and a note in tidy script. Legends deserve closets. Good men deserve kitchens. Colette read it twice and burned it in the stove, then saved the ash in a jar on a high shelf where no one would think to look. On a soft evening in late summer, the judge walked up the porch steps with a bottle and a smile seasoned by 3 careful years. He set the bottle down, cleared his throat, and said the number aloud like a milestone carved on stone. 1,000. Bastien stood in the yard with sawdust on his shirt and looked up slow, as if the number were a bird he didn't want to startle. He had not stopped counting. The habit had become his spine. But hearing it out loud was different, a door opening with a sound a man knows he will never hear again. Roch sat on the steps whetting a knife, the motion lazy, the grin he tried to hide very real. "You made it," the judge said, "by law and by labor." Neighbors gathered like a tide, the blacksmith wiping hands on a rag, the teacher tucking hair behind her ear, the two stiff-collared women who had once crossed the street now carrying a pie. Somebody started a tune on a fiddle. Somebody set out cups. Somebody said grace without being asked, and the words felt right on the air. Jules came running from the lane, taller, breathless, fishing line in one hand, and flung himself into Bastien the way boys fling themselves into the future. Reckless, sure. "We saw 3 trout," he said, eyes shining. "And Roche says I can track a deer by the way the grass forgives." Bastien laughed and ruffled his hair, and the sound that came out of him was new, a thing with corners sanded off. Colette leaned against the porch post, watching, letting a quiet settle in her bones that she had wanted for more winters than she could count. She felt the number 1,000 as a weight she did not mind, a promise kept. But even as the fiddle sketched joy into the evening, one truth tugged at the hem of her peace. Secrets earned by survival still needed light. There was one left, a small, bright, dangerous truth that had waited too long in the dark. They walked at first light to the river bend where Bastien's child hand had once drawn its shape in dirt, and his outlaw hand had echoed it on careful notes. Mist lay low, curling around reeds, and the water moved with that old, confident patience that does not explain itself to men. Colette tucked her kerchief into her pocket and let the morning wind have her hair. Bastien took off his hat and held it against his thigh as if he were entering a church. For a while, they said the kind of nothing that means everything. "Oh, look at the heron. Do you hear the frogs?" Because some truths prefer gentle roads. "I came to your porch the first time because I couldn't stand the thought of a child sleeping cold," he said at last, voice low, almost embarrassed by its honesty. "I stayed away because I was a coward about wanting what I told myself I didn't deserve." He swallowed and tried again. "I loved you from the shadows, because the shadows felt safer than the world." Colette did not interrupt. She let the words find their own room in the morning, then walked closer and set her hand over his heart where the old burn of the fire had left the hair singed fine. "You did not outsmart the law by tricks," she said. "You outlasted it by telling the truth, piece by piece, day by day, until there was nothing left to hide." He told her the rest then, every small hinge on which their years had turned, how Roch had saved his life twice and asked nothing but good behavior, how Verdun had cut the ferry rope to turn a ledger into a grave, how the letter Beaumont waved had indeed been written by a liar's hand, how fear had kept him moving and love had kept him near. The telling did not shrink him, it fitted him. She laughed once through tears at the memory of beeswax on window seams, at a rifle wrapped so a boy's shoulder would not bruise, at the way a town can be mean until it remembers itself. "And Etienne?" he asked, because a brave life still stumbles at the name of a dead man. Colette tilted her head. "He was good," she said, simple and complete. "You are, too. Grief does not mean there is only one chair at the table." They returned to the yard where neighbors were already gathering, coffee steaming, bread sliced, fiddle tuned. Jules held up a small trout in triumph, and then, at Colette's look, carried it back to the river to live, because some victories are better alive. The judge wiped ink from his fingers and smiled in that weathered way of his. Roch leaned against the fence, arms crossed, watching with the contentment of a man who has done the heaviest part and now enjoys the view. Bastien stepped onto the porch, not as a shadow, not as a legend, but as a man whose debts had become stories and whose stories had become a life. He raised his voice so all could hear, the words plain and weighty as a beam set right in a frame. My name is Bastien Durand, he said, and the name no longer asked permission to stay. I am done counting. The square did not explode into cheer. It did a better thing. It breathed. People nodded like things had clicked into their proper joints. Colette moved to his side and slid her hand into his, not hidden now, not borrowed. Jules wedged himself between them with the shamelessness of a loved child. Across the way, a man in a green coat paused on the ridge just long enough to tip his hat to the river, and to a decision he had not foreseen. He turned his horse and rode toward another horizon, leaving this story unbroken. Evening came warm. The porch held 3 chairs, and then 4, because life does that when you're not looking, makes more room. Laughter stitched the day to the night. Someone told the part about the ferry, someone else the part about the bell tower and the click that wasn't a shot, and the stories did what good stories do. They kept fear small and courage bright. When the stars came out, Colette leaned her head against Bastien's shoulder, and he, a man who had counted his days like a prisoner, closed his eyes and let the number fall away. The law had wanted a trophy. What it got was a town that remembered its spine, a widow who reclaimed her table, a boy who learned how rivers forgive, a mountain who set down his rifle, and an outlaw who learned how to stay. The river went on saying what it always says to anyone patient enough to listen. Begin again, but tell the truth. And so they did.